Welcome to our event today. I see that people are joining us now on the webinar, Thinking Long-Term about Syrian Refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. We'll hear from several of the expert researchers who produced the reports we'll be discussing today. My name is Jeff Staub, Director of Communications at the World Refugee Migration Council. Just a couple of notes before we start. We'll leave the chat box open for you to exchange information, but please use Zoom's Q&A function to pose your question to panelists. You can find that at the bottom of the screen. We'll get to as many of them as possible toward the end of the event. Now, I would like to welcome His Royal Highness Prince El Hassan bin Talal, who is an honorary chair of the World Refugee and Migration Council and a longtime supporter of the Council's work in the region, to make some opening remarks. Your Highness, please proceed.
Well, thank you very much. May I congratulate you all on a successful launch. And as I was saying earlier, your timing could not have been better. At a time when donor fatigue levels have never been higher, your recommendations offer actionable solutions for host states to execute with relative ease, so one hopes. The cascading crises in Lebanon, northern Syria, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and elsewhere augur badly for refugees everywhere if the international community does not step up to all its obligations, both responsibly and immediately. What underlies our reports, your reports, is a need for a primary change, and I quote, from seeing refugees as a burden to host countries to seeing them as human capital to be used in meeting the development priorities of host countries, to move from the vulnerability-based approach to the development approach, to humanize the stats, so to speak. We need to move away from relief to development, empowerment and entrustment of refugee populations. And this is causing some angst. We are happy to say that in Jordan, 20% of the refugee population from Syria is solvent. And this, of course, reflects on their talent and aptitude and also our openness in hosting. I question refugeedom. Should it be thought of primarily in terms of human capital or in terms of motility, as Vincent Kaufman, Manfred Max Bergman, and Dominic Joyce's concept of motility is an extremely intriguing one. And I bring it back to your attention in terms of the following key words: access, competence, appropriation. And I would like to suggest that allowing for and working towards a multiplicity of mobility trajectories conceived of in both spatial and social terms is an undertaking key to a future where the rights of refugees have ebbed and can begin to flow again. And I refer in particular in this instance to the Levant. Descartes once said, if everything is west, where does the sun rise? Ex orientem lux. The significance of the Levant and the transnational nature of the refugee crisis in the Levant, and even beyond the two rivers, is of huge importance. The current resettlement rates, as per the United Nations HCR, point to one of the lowest levels of resettlement witnessed in almost 2 decades, a blow for refugee protection and for the ability to save lives and protect those most at risk. Today, I would like to suggest that in Syria, as a number of states, including Denmark and Sweden, restrict protection and increase the pressure on refugees from Syria to go home, the harrowing testimonies in Amnesty International's recent reports on the torture, rape, and disappearance of refugee returnees is proof that, by and large, no part of the country is safe to return to. And today, an estimated 1.4 million refugees require urgent resettlement, while Canada and Germany have done admirably in that regard with respect to Syria's refugees, others have not. I'd like to make a few points here and say it was only when geopolitical interest of the West in hosting those fleeing from the former Soviet Union faded that resettlement was cast aside in the mid-1980s as a preferred durable solution. Of course, the end of the Cold War coincided with an increase in the labor supply, contributed to the move away from resettlement as a preferred solution. And I'd like to point out here that algorithmic weighting, recognizing the aptitudes and talents of people, does contribute positively to the workforce. But I wonder whether that weighting should actually wait until they have arrived at the borders of Western countries, or whether it should take place as or before they leave this part of the world. And now, of course, with the Afghan crisis and the overflow into Pakistan, whether this should be a humanizing process, a humanizing of the stats and the digits before they leave. Shaknov from the University of Oxford suggests that the placement of asylum seeking within the discourse of immigration policy destabilizes the interstate system, and even more so in an era of receding multilateralism and even rising inequality. A preference for containing displaced populations in zones of conflict raises troubling human rights issues, is a risky strategy for inducing state instability, and may undermine the fragile formation of new or reconstituted states. And let me remind you here, as I am deeply concerned about the water situation in our region, that water is a human right, not to mention the other SDGs that speak of the index of deprivation, which include, of course, hunger and other issues. So the global compact of refugees, where are we? To ease pressure on host countries, to enhance refugee self-reliance, to expand access to third country solutions, to support conditions in countries of origin for return in safety and dignity. However, the GCR was viewed at that time, the GCR, as opposed to other compacts. The final GCR document was in fact quite conservative in what it sought to preserve: the existing international framework for refugee protection. And I recall discussing protection on so many occasions with Lloyd Axworthy, but today we have no protection from the climate apart from the shortages across the board. And I look at with particular sadness at the situation in Yemen today. The treatment of refugees and asylum seekers is just not about protection and sanctuary, but more generally about the nature of their human identity, their personhood, if you would like to use that expression, that Adamic personhood and the nature of citizenship, belonging, and national identity. When will we realize that in the other lies, as well as a multitude of ordinary and extraordinary hopes, dreams, aspirations, fears, and worries, a potential hope for the future? Those who have been refugeed for 2.5 decades are coming up to the following figures: humanitarian relief and political solutions. How do they apply? The figures, of course, are an increase of 5 to 6 million refugees in a world of 7.5 billion people. Is this a global crisis as we look at it on the ground? Are refugees constituting less than 1/3 of 1% of the world's population? Are the so-called refugee crises in actual fact double crises of global consciousness, if you will, and crises of global governance? How are we supposed to perceive all of this? The refugee working group of the Madrid peace process, is that a model for the Syrian conflict? Do we see the possibility of a mediator, advocate, and problem solver in its capacity as chair of the group? And in particular, I refer here to the significant impact in terms of humanitarian situations of Palestinian refugees. I conclude by saying, if I may, dear friends, with all due respect to the outstanding work of World Refugee and Migration Council, the utility of an interdisciplinary, interstate, and interregional working group, not least of all on Syrian refugees, cannot be discounted. With unity of purpose, maybe we might just be able to pull out of this very gloomy period in which we are all living. Thank you. Salutations to you all.
Many thanks to you, Your Highness. I'll now give the floor over to today's moderator and Vice President of Research at the World Refugee and Migration Council, Elizabeth Ferris.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Your Highness, for those opening remarks and really putting this issue in the broader global context. As you said, it is indeed a gloomy time when you look at the number of crises, COVID, lack of resources, in fact, the desperation of people, including those who've been displaced for long periods of time. So today we're going to focus on the research project we've recently concluded called Thinking Long-Term About Syrian Refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. The refugees have been in the region since 2011, that's a decade, really to assess where we are, what has been the economic impact, and what are some non-traditional ways of increasing support for countries that have hosted large numbers of refugees. This research was supported by Canada's IDRC, International Development Research Center, and benefited from a very active and strong advisory group of experts in the region who met several times with the researchers. So I'll introduce the researchers now. This is some of the researchers who worked on this project. Then we'll have a conversation about some of the findings from these 3 research projects on Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, and then open it up to Q&A. As Jeff said, we encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. We'll also post a link in the chat to all the full research papers and a summary of the research papers that are available. The summaries available also in Arabic and Turkish. But for now, let me begin by introducing our speakers. I'll start with Jordan. Yusuf Mansour is the chairman of the board of trustees of TAG University College for Innovation and the CEO of InConsult in Jordan. He has previously held senior positions in the government, including Minister of State for Economic Affairs and Senior Economic Advisor to the Prime Minister. He specializes in economic issues, has done a lot of work on refugees and on economic policies generally in Jordan and elsewhere. From Lebanon, we have Maha Schwab, who's the director of the Center for Lebanese Studies at the Lebanese American University. She's been there since 2012 and is a visiting fellow at the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge since 2020. She's worked on a lot of different issues in different countries, but her main passion and focus has been on education, including education of refugee children. So welcome, Maha. She's joined also from Lebanon with Catherine Brune, who's been working with the Center for Lebanese Studies on a major research project called From Education to Employment, Trajectories of Young People in Lebanon's and Jordan's Refugee Crisis. She also serves as director of the Center for Development and Emergency Practice at Oxford Brookes University. And finally, we're joined by Kamal Karici, who's a non-resident senior fellow in the Center for United States and Europe, the Turkey Project at the Brookings Institution. His particular area of expertise is Turkish foreign policy and migration studies. From 2013 to 2020, he was Tussiade's senior fellow at Brookings and director of the Turkey Project. He's written a number of books, including Turkey in the West, Fault Lines in a Troubled Alliance. And before that, I had the privilege of co-authoring a book with Kamal on the Syrian refugee situation and some of the politics behind this. But thanks, and thank you for all of the hard work you've done these past months and putting together the research and going through multiple drafts of the project. We really appreciate it. And I think we'll start with Lebanon and go through maybe a couple of rounds of conversation. So I'll start with Maha and just ask you, given the multiple crises that Lebanon has faced in the recent years, what has been the economic impact of Syrian refugees in Lebanon? And you're on.
Sorry, I think my colleague Katrina is going to answer this question.
Okay, sorry, Catherine.
Yes, thank you. We made the division of labor. And thank you for both to you, Elizabeth, and the World Refugee and Migration Council for making it possible for us to engage with this important question. And also, let me just use this opportunity to thank our co-authors Ali Faki and Mohammed Hamoud, who's also been very much involved in the answering this question. So to answer your question on the economic impact of the Syrian refugee crisis in Lebanon, in our research, we aim to understand better the impact of the refugee crisis and policies on Lebanon's economic situation. We hope to be able to use this as a basis for proposing alternative solutions that could support refugees and hosts amid the collapse of the economy. Lebanon hosts the highest number of refugees per capita in the world, as you probably know, with the government estimating that 1.5 million Syrian refugees reside in the country. And at the same time, the country is in deep financial and governance crisis. So we did our work in 3 steps to answer this question. In order to establish the impact of the Syrian refugee crisis on the Lebanese economy, our first step was to analyze the economic trends between 1990 and 2010, meaning before the Syrian crisis. We show in the report that even before the war in Syria, Lebanon suffered from several economic challenges. External shocks further worsened the country's economic volatility. So when the Syrian refugees started arriving in Lebanon in 2011, they came to a country that was already experiencing a downward economic trend. Throughout the last 11 years as refugees in Lebanon, the Syrian refugees, together with the overall population, have therefore experienced this continued downward spiral of the current crisis. This is a crisis that the World Bank has described as likely to rank in the top 10 or possibly top 3 most severe crises globally since the mid-19th century. So in our effort to better understand how the Syrian refugee crisis impacted on the economic situation, our second step was therefore to conduct an analysis to understand the impact of the Syrian refugee influx on the Lebanese macroeconomic landscape. We used monthly data for the period from June 2011 to December 2020, and given the major gaps in data in the Lebanese context, the data used here had to be extracted from various sources. And our analyses were very clear. The arrival of the Syrian refugees did not in itself have an impact on the economic developments in the country and do not affect labor force participation and unemployment rates at the national level. On the contrary to popular belief and policy discourses, our results show that refugees may even have caused economic growth. These are very important findings. So to complete our analysis, our third step was to situate these findings into the wider political landscape in the country by analyzing policy and popular discourses. Our findings that Syrian refugees did not have an impact on the economic development in the country is important because we found multiple studies and publications report that Syrian refugee inflows have had negative effects on the Lebanese economy. For example, analyzing the documentation and statements from international donor meetings in London and Brussels from 2016 to 2021. It is clear that both the international and Lebanese government's discourse focuses on the costs that Lebanon has incurred as a result of the refugee crisis. Following from this, studies have shown that there is a general perception among the Lebanese population that the Syrian refugees are harming the Lebanese economy. So while initially welcoming the Syrian refugees, Lebanon has gradually introduced policies that are more hostile towards the refugees, and its policies may be described as policies of exclusion. Now, the majority of the Syrian refugees do not have legal residency, and the Syrian refugees are considered guests and are not given a formal status. And this lack of status must be understood as the backbone of any policy framework. The guest approach was to a large extent put in place to prevent integration of the Syrian refugees into all sectors of the country, including the economic sector. Yet in our analysis of the economic development in the country, it becomes clear that Syrian refugees and the Lebanese population are experiencing a shared poverty, shared exclusion, and shared marginalization. So this realization must be taken into account when we address the current financial and governance crisis in the country. And I believe we can come back to this later in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. You paint a complex picture of little economic impact of the refugees, and yet the contrast with public opinion is really striking, a theme that I think we'll see in other countries as well. Let's turn now to Jordan and welcome to Yusuf. As part of your study, Yusuf, you looked at the impact of international assistance on Jordan's policies toward refugees. And what has been the impact on Jordan's continued hosting of the of international aid?
Well, it has been significant actually, but I would like to start my answer by looking at the period immediately before the arrival of the refugees and then after. The aid in the 3 years before the refugees started arriving in Jordan, and I'm referring to the Syrian refugees, of course, was about $1 billion a year on average. Now, this has increased by 215% during the period 2012 to 2019. So in the 8 years that followed, there was a significant increase in the amount of aid received. There was a good portion of the aid went into host communities. About 125% of the aid allocated to this resilience plan, the national resilience plan, went into host communities. Significant amount also went to the general budget because the government had projects that were under stress from receiving the refugees. You have to consider that the refugees were concentrated in areas that already had stress on their resources, on their infrastructure. And so there was, as a result of the refugee crisis, there was increased aid to Jordan as a whole, and because of the refugees. Now, the relationship between aid received and government spending, if we look at it, it is you notice that spending by the government did not grow at the same rate as the growth in the aid received by the government. This indicates that the aid was used to substitute for some of the spending by the government, rather than adding to existing spending. Furthermore, from 2013 to 2019, aid comprised 30% of the government spending, compared to only 13% before that, before 2012. So there was a significant increase in the government capacity to spend because of the aid received. But this is dangerous as well if we were to analyze it, because majority of Jordanian government spending has been on current expenditures. So it means it creates commitments in the future. When you hire people, you have to hire them beyond, a year or 2 or 3, and so they make commitments in the future. When you look at it, the total amount of aid, you wish that there had been some amount of aid allocated to infrastructure, particularly the infrastructure that was under duress, which is the health services, education, and the water. The water table was affected in Jordan by the refugees because simply Jordan is one of the 3 water poorest in the world. And so just having the additional numbers, and I'm one of the advocates of saying that, yes, refugees can be a boon, can benefit an economy as a human capital. But in the case of water, there was stress. And had some of the resources been directed at improving the water infrastructure, it would have been significant and would have created jobs not only for Jordanians, but also for refugees in the current future, in the near future, and would have safeguarded the economy in the future.
Hey, thank you very much. Again, a complicated story looking at the increase in international aid and yet some of the real gaps in terms of the experiences of Jordan as a hosting country. And Kamal, we just heard about the impact in Lebanon of changing public opinion. What about in Turkey? How has public opinion toward the Syrian refugees changed over time? You're on mute.
I'd like to underline how honored I am to share this platform with His Highness, as well as with yourself, Professor Ferris, and Lloyd Axworthy, and these colleagues that we have had a chance to work together. And these feelings are shared by my colleagues, Turkish colleagues that worked on this project, Gökçe Uysal and Murat Erdoğan. To summarize the public opinion is that there's a paradoxical situation in Turkey. Syrian refugees themselves feel increasingly settled and integrated into Turkish society, while the Turkish public received them with open arms in the early days. is now increasingly demanding that they be returned to Syria. My colleague Murat Erdoğan has been running periodically a survey called Syrian Barometer, which keeps the finger on the pulse of both sides, the Syrian refugees as well as the Turkish side. Just to give you an idea, in 2017, when Syrians were asked whether they were planning to return, a large majority of them said yes. But by 2019 and 2020, 52 and 78% of them responded by saying that they did not have any plans to return. And this is also the case if there was a regime that was friendlier to the Syrian refugees. And Syrians, when asked, 89% of them in 2019 felt integrated into the Turkish society at different levels, some strongly, some less strongly. And this figure by 2020 had grown to 91%. When we look at the Turkish attitudes, it's a very different one. In 2014, when this survey was first taken, 58% of the Turkish people that were surveyed said they disagreed with sending back the Syrian refugees. In 2019, 83% of those surveyed wanted to see the Syrians return to Syria. And in 2019 and 20, only 13 and 16% of the Turkish public felt that Syrians had become integrated. The Turkish public also is very resistant to the idea of Syrian refugees staying in the long run, let alone acquiring citizenship. 85% of them say no to the idea of Syrians being granted Turkish citizenship. Whereas when bureaucrats, academics, experts are surveyed, more than 80% of them recognize that the Syrians are here to stay in Turkey. Though the Turkish population received Syrians with open arms and socially accepted them to a large extent, this feeling is eroding in Turkey. It's eroding towards toleration, and there is growing concern that things may get even worse, creating a situation where Syrians feel increasingly excluded and maybe develop a parallel society culture. And the next question is, of course, how is it that we might be able to confront this challenge? And I leave this to the next round.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, I think it's fascinating to look at this gap in perceptions between Syrian refugees in Turkey and Turkish public opinion that seems to be moving in the wrong direction, if you will. Let's continue our conversation here for a little while, and I'll turn back to Yusuf. I mean, you talk in your paper about how the international community can be more supportive of governments like Jordan. You know, the traditional response when there's great need is to call for more humanitarian assistance. But what is there beyond humanitarian assistance that could provide more responsibility sharing, more support for Jordan? Yusuf.
Thank you. In the paper, we have adopted about 20 of the WRMC recommendations. We emphasize the need to address infrastructure deficits, easing trade restrictions, avoiding gender bias, upholding the rights and dignities of refugees, localizing aid, and strengthening the capacity of civil society in the country. The thrust of our recommendations aim at providing comprehensive solutions for a long-term stay of the refugees. Internally, we recommended that Jordan should remove all remaining regulatory barriers on refugee labor that prevent refugees from exercising their rights to work and freedom of movement. We also encourage that Jordan, among others, should encourage research to measure the social and economic impact of refugees in different areas and locales within the country. This is colored by the thesis, the belief that refugees should be viewed as a human gift and not a burden, and an open, accepting society could really benefit from them. And at least this is a strong view that I hold, and I was honored to hear His Royal Highness Prince Hassan echo that. I'm very, very proud. In terms of trade, the WTO should give additional allowances to Jordan for hosting refugees and offer its export duty relief, given certain qualifying criteria. This would be similar to the treatment regarding the rules of origin qualification that Jordan received from the European Union. But this is not enough as well. Countries should work on allowing, on enabling Jordan market access. And market access is not achieved only by getting reduced rules of origin qualifications. And so the United States and Europe could assist with that, and we look forward to that, and this should be a subject of debate. Regarding the debt situation, Jordan has undergone a series of economic reform programs since 1989, actually, except for 4 years, we have been under economic reform since 1989 with the IMF and other donor organizations. It is vital for Jordan, given the current debt level of the country, to support Action 37 of the WRMC, which calls on the IMF to develop a facility that provides longer-term loans on highly concessional terms for countries hosting large numbers of refugees. And Jordan would really benefit from such discourse. Jordan could then negotiate long-term loans with the IMF to receive the required relief at preferential rates. Particular emphasis should be on loans for infrastructure. And this would really help in hosting the refugees, and it would help also the future of the country, so that win-win situations are created. These are some of our recommendations in the paper. Of course, the recommendations are longer than this, so I just tried to stick to the 5 minutes.
Yeah, thanks to all of you. I hope everybody realizes what an amazing feat this is to have researchers who spent months working on 50-page papers asked to speak for just 5 minutes on particular issues. So thanks to the researchers for accepting this challenge. And I think the point you make, Yusuf, about as we think long-term about Syrian refugees, it's really time to engage trade and investment and debt policy. This is too big and too long-term for just humanitarian response. We'll turn now. Yes.
May I just comment? In fact, in the Jordan Compact, the mention of investment and training and joint ventures and all, this was all mentioned there, but I think very little attention were paid to that. And I think this should be reopened, and this should become a major part of the dialogue, the development dialogue in the coming months or years.
Good. Thank you for pointing.
Investment, trade, etc. Yeah.
And we'll turn now to Kamal and the Turkish situation. In your paper, you identify also a number of ways that the international community could be more supportive of Turkey's hosting of refugees. What would you say are priority actions the international community could take? You're on mute again.
Sorry. Picking up new habits is not that easy, and internalizing them. In our report, we we argued that the best way out from the situation that Turkey finds itself is to ensure sustainable employment for Syrians. Right now, the situation is such that the Turkish government has extended temporary protection to Syrian refugees. 3.7 million of them have access to health and education services in Turkey. The European Union provides funding as well, and a good part of it goes into two very innovative programs called the Economic Social Safety Net, and 1.8 million Syrian refugees and a few other refugees receive a monthly stipend. And then there's the conditional cash transfer for education that provides Syrians and other refugees with some degree of income. But this is not enough for their survival. So a large number of Syrian refugees do work in the Turkish economy, but a great majority of them work informally, and that comes with its own challenges and complications. The pandemic has adversely affected this practice. And again, in the Syrian barometers, the very last one, close to 50% of them mentioned that they had lost their jobs. This is one aspect of the challenging picture as far as the Turkish economy goes from the Syrian refugees' perspective. But when the Syrian refugees first began to arrive in Turkey in 2011, the Turkish economy was booming and the per capita income was just short of $13,000. Whereas today, the Turkish economy is in a very different state, faces grand challenges, and per capita income is dropping towards $8,000 per capita. There is increasing unemployment, increasing inflation that is putting stress on the Turkish public as well as on the Syrians. And maybe that also explains why the Turkish public opinion has been moving in the direction that I pointed out earlier on. How can one come out of this situation? The United Nations 3RP reports with funding from the European Union does put emphasis on livelihood access for Syrian refugees. But so far, the emphasis has been greatly on the supply side, meaning preparing Syrians for the Turkish labor market, improving their Turkish, improving their skills, etc. We argue in our report that much more emphasis needs to be put on the demand side for Syrian refugee labor and on job creation. And for the idea of job creation, we have looked into the Global Compact on Refugees, but also on the call of action of the World Refugee and Migration Council, particularly number 35. Together with the Global Compact on Refugees, there is the idea of providing trade facilitation to countries that are hosting large number of refugees in return for employing refugees in the formal economy. Yusuf Mansour has given the EU-Jordanian Compact as possible, as one such example. We dig deeper. We have additional ideas of how to go about it. Just to give an example, the possibility of a qualified industrial zone close to the Syrian border from where companies could export products at competitive rates to developed countries' markets. There is also a possibility of creating trade compromises to encourage Syrian refugees to work in the Turkish agricultural sector as part of Turkey's economic relations with the European Union there. We do offer other suggestions to ease the challenges that Turkey is facing, as well as Lebanon and Jordan. One such recommendation I know is one that gets repeated frequently, but resettlement is going to be critical, especially now with what we are facing in Afghanistan, when we suggest that time might be right to go back to the experience with the boat people in the multilateral agreements that were reached in 1979 and then subsequently in 1989. So there needs to be a multilateral push to show to these three countries, as well as Turkey, that the international community is out there to share some of the burden. I realize I've run out of time, but some additional recommendations are in the report, including in return for these efforts on the part of the international community, the Turkish side starting a discussion on how to maybe develop a path towards citizenship and local integration for at least some of the Syrian refugees. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kamal. Lots of ideas in there and lots of opportunities perhaps for increasing international support. So let's turn to Maha now. We haven't mentioned COVID so far in this presentation, but COVID has certainly had an economic impact on Lebanon and all countries. And in light of the economic situation and multiple pressures faced by Lebanon, what recommendations would you make to the international community for increasing their support for Lebanon as a refugee hosting country?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I want to highlight first the global atmosphere into which these policies and interventions are being developed. There's a very important point that we should not forget is within the power dynamics of negotiation between humanitarian organizations and the host government, there's a big elephant in the room, which is xenophobia. The xenophobia that is exist in the global north, which is also determining the kind of negotiation that is happening. The priority is not on development, particularly for refugees. The priority was how to keep refugees in these host countries and how to support these governments to continue to maintain them. It's not, it's mere survival. I think that's the whole mindset of the response. And this is why I think we failed miserably. The whole world and the humanitarian response failed miserably because, we are talking about governments increasingly under pressure from right-wing public opinion that is anti-refugees. And we see it in the Olympics finally hosting a refugee team, which is a disgrace for all of us and for humanity. We're shutting down, and in this meeting, we're talking about how we can create development amid all of this. And I think one big issue is xenophobia, is anti-refuginess and anti-refugees. This has, what we see in Lebanon is we've seen lots of humanitarian aid fixated on survival, but it's accompanied by security response. The government in Lebanon is concerned, sees refugees as a security threat. They don't see them as a potential. They don't see them as a solution. So I think this is one big issue that we need to address. And I think humanitarian organizations need to respond to this, and they need to be aware about these, this politics when it comes to negotiation. Because what happened is, in the end, humanitarian organization and the donors negotiated conditions that are in favor of the host government. This brings me to the next big important point, which I think there won't be development if corruption is not addressed. And humanitarian organizations and the donors have let many of these host governments off the hook when it came to transparency, accountability. We're doing study at the moment on integrity in education. And even prior to the crisis, most of these countries, Lebanon and Jordan, have been receiving a huge amount of aid. Yet we see very limited development, even prior to the crisis. So what is going to change now? Nothing. You are giving more money to corrupt regimes, so you're not going to see developments, not even for their own population, let alone to see it for a refugee population that no one wants it to be there. And this is why I think we need more pressure and more attention to anti-corruption measures, to integrity, to indicators that assess accountability. We can't just keep funding and giving money without looking at what kind of outputs we have in the end. And this is why I think, I don't want to repeat the recommendations concerning seeing refugees as assets, participation on par rather than, participation as inferior population. They just receive, they are at the end. Because even if we talk about localization, which has been seen as kind of like the new trend in this recent refugee crisis, what we see in Lebanon in terms of localizations, donor understood localization as investing in the host governments, but these host governments are corrupt and they not going to really care about refugees. Localization, in my opinion, is investing in the local community, whether refugees or non-refugees, rather than just giving it to the government and not even asking them where did the money go or what kind of results have been produced. These are some of the quick recommendations. I'm not sure if I've used all my time, but this is why I think, we can't talk about local development if we don't talk about the big, P in politics in the room. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for your comments. We'll turn now to some of the questions and we'll close with some closing remarks by our chair of the World Refugee and Migration Council, Lloyd Axworthy. But Your Royal Highness, Prince Al Hassan bin Talal, there are a couple of questions I thought you might like to answer. One from Fawa Javal, talking about Jordan's human security agenda and wondering how to promote this in other Muslim conflict affected countries. And a related question perhaps from Tag El-Kazin, saying that given the Afghanistan situation right now, what is the moral obligation of Muslim and Arab countries to receiving refugees from these countries rather than depending on countries outside to resettle them? If you're still with us, Prince Hassan.
Yes.
Yes, I don't know if you just heard the questions that I directed towards you. One about Jordan's human security agenda and whether this can be applied to other conflict-affected Muslim states. And another that given the crisis in Afghanistan, what is the moral obligation of Muslim and Arab states to take refugees from these regions?
Well, thank you for those two questions. I just would like to answer one, that human security in and of itself is overshadowed by the war on terror. And in that context, we have always been working as an international community against something. It is time that we started working for empowerment and enablement of human beings without distinction or discrimination in terms of human security. So I would say that the right to water is human security, the right to food is human security. But quite frankly, the silos of the United Nations and the silos of our particular governments, I think practically in the global south and maybe even in the global north, are such that they do not work in an interdisciplinary manner. And the point that I wanted to make about Afghan refugees is that obviously the Jordanian government, as I understand, is simply not able to resettle people, and therefore there has been an offer to help with transit locations. I've been trying to ask for artisans, for example, who have come from Afghanistan to Doha to be allowed further passage if they can be financed independently, which is available, it would appear, to train Jordanian, to train trainers in artisan work. That's the only small example I have, but we're only talking about a small number of people. But we have been asked, I think, for a quota of over 5,000, I think, Afghans to be settled in Jordan. But of course, the whole thing I wanted to focus on is that this whole meeting is about thinking long-term about Syrian refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. So please focus on the Levant. I mean, the Visegrad 4 countries, as my friends know, Poland, Czechia, Hungary, and Slovakia, are 71 million people. We, the Arab content of the Levant, are almost certainly over 50 million people. If we are to add Iraq, and then also, as I'm totally opposed to Ajam Arab, I think if we were to add Turkey and Iran, which of course is politically unthinkable at the moment in terms of Iran, I'm not being judgmental, I'm just stating a fact. I just like to suggest that talking of the Levant would attract so much more attention, and in particular, Middle Eastern Christians. Please bear in mind the wonderful book study presented, I think it appears in September, of Father Mitri Rahib, The Politics of Persecution, Middle Eastern Christians in an Age of Empire. And I refer here in particular to the Arab Christians, because we feel we're Arab first and then Christian or Muslim or Jewish or whatever it may be in Latin America. Over 500,000 Latin Americans with Palestinian roots live as fourth or fifth generation Palestinians in Latin America alone, with over half of them in Chile, where they comprise 3% of the population. Now, I just wonder whether we can't develop a relationship on the basis of Levant, but I don't think we can develop a relationship on the basis of bilateral Lebanon, Latin America, Syria, Latin America, Jordan, Latin America. It has to be a region-to-region approach. And I think this could become a story of resilience to celebrate rather than a story of persecution to express so much concern about. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you very much for your responses as well. I'll turn to Yusuf now. There are a couple of questions specifically about Jordan. One from Shada Namazri saying that, is the recommendation regarding refugee labor barriers in Jordan, should that apply to all refugees? And another about whether Jordan's trade strategy and special economic zone policy would actually cause sustainable growth. And you're on mute. Sorry, you're on mute.
Mute myself. I'm unmuted now. Good, because I haven't said anything of significance. I'll try to say something of significance now. No, the papers were focused on the Syrian refugees. So the recommendations were made regarding Syrian refugees. Now, I think there is no problem extending them to other refugees as well. We're all humans in the end. And the same would apply to other refugees. The trade policy, I think in Jordan, we need to focus more on trade, industry, and investment related together, that they should complement each other. It's like a tripod. And I think we can benefit from integrating the refugees. We can integrate in terms of skills, transfer of skills. In Jordan, we're very competitive in the high skill and lower skills. We have the missing middle. Some of the Syrian refugees are very good artisans, mechanics, etc., etc., and they can contribute significantly to the Jordanian economy. And given a full chance, I think we'll see a larger contribution.
Yusuf, if I may just butt in, forgive me, but to talk about women. Jordan's workforce is pitiful when it comes to only 2% women in the workforce. Yeah. We have over 54% women graduate from universities. What are they getting? Marriage certificates? I mean, health bells, the time has come to recognize that we can't talk about the workforce, shughul, without actually inspiring the participation of women. And that applies so much to, I mean, we have a soup kitchen, which is Syrian, Jordanian, Palestinian. I said it's the best example of Arab unity that I've seen yet. I mean, they're talking about exchanging recipes. But let's, I mean, recognize, and that is where Kamal can give us so much support with his team on women, on your Center for Hydro Politics in Istanbul. There's so much that you can do to lead this Levant resurgence, which I'm calling for and have been calling all my life. I want to thank Maha and express my deep sympathy for where you're coming from. But we simply have to talk to the issue. We have to rally.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you, Your Royal Highness. I think in Jordan as well, for Jordanian women, participation is very dismal. There is 12% participation of women in the labor force, Jordanian women. which is among the lowest in the world. Part of the reason for that is the lack of public transport systems and time-saving technologies, because working women, they have to work at home and work outside the home as well, and things like that. And so they share our problems. The refugees share our problems. And when we looked at the number of permits given to men and women under the Jordan Compact, there was like 170,000 given to men and 8,000 given to women, which is dismal as well. And so we look forward to greater.
Yusuf, I now understand why you and I have so little hair.
Okay, I'm not going to comment on that. Maha, there's a difficult question for you in Lebanon. The question coming from Suha Tutunji, saying, how does the history of Syrian hegemony in Lebanon affect Lebanese attitudes toward the Syrian refugees?
Thank you. I just want to commend the comment by Prince Hassan raising the issue around gender and women participation. In a recent study, which is going to be published on education to employment trajectories in Lebanon and Jordan, it was very interesting that the gap between nationals and refugees in Jordan was less compared to Lebanon, where we see huge gaps between refugees and nationals in Lebanon in relation to education and employment. But in Jordan, the biggest issue was gender. It was women participation in both in education, but more in employment. And I think there's a lot to be said about how this issue could be addressed. I also want to touch on another issue related to the previous discussion. Is, I don't know, as far as I know, I mean, I don't know much about Jordan, but in Lebanon, I don't think we even have a plan for economic or industry development or any sort of, economic development. And I think this is part of a bigger issue. And when you have a crisis of this scale and funding coming into a country, there has to be the deep and serious discussion about what kind of economic development we want. I mean, Turkey, there has been, the economic development seen over the past 20 years in Turkey. I know that the situation now is much worse, but still, there's nothing that can prevent Lebanon or Jordan from making, some economic and industrial development. Back to Suhas Tutunji's question, I think, we've been unfortunate in this crisis that one of the ruling parties is one of the most xenophobic parties that have been historically anti-refugees, which is Tayar al-Hur, the Free Patriotic Movement. But I think overall there is, xenophobia is increasing everywhere. And I think this hasn't helped. And I think if there's anything researchers can do is to produce this kind of data that in this study, we found there was no negative impact. And it's us researchers have the duty to, to engage with public media, to diffuse some of the misconceptions, and we have to be more proactive around this issue. But I think in general, in Lebanon overall, there historically have been anti-Palestinian refugees, and now, a new person who joined the club, unfortunately, which is Syrian refugees, tend to be blamed for any issue that happens in the country.
Thank you. And I'll direct the last question to Kamal. And this question is from Karen Voglin, who says that, given the fact that refugees aren't having a major negative economic impact on countries, is the rationale for providing more support to refugee hosting countries to encourage them to keep hosting refugees, thinking about some of the sentiment in Europe and North America. So Kamal, your thoughts on that?
In the Turkish experience, I wouldn't want to give the impression as if the Syrian refugees have only been a burden on the Turkish economy. On the contrary, very significant funds are coming to Turkey. That's having a multiplier effect in terms of employment as well. I personally see quite a few of my former students who are entering various UN agencies as well as NGOs. And then there is what I call the darker side of Syrian refugees' labor contribution, which is reducing production costs for some of the companies, because they are employing them without granting them the social security support that they are supposed to be doing there. So the earlier ideas and ideas that I have also been shared with other colleagues here is an effort in the direction of drawing these refugees into the formal economy and kill two birds with one stone, benefit them as well as benefit the host community members and the economy at large. And what we have not mentioned so far is that by progressing along these lines, you will also offer a win to countries, especially in Europe, who don't want to see refugees and keep building walls and dumping funds on these countries to take care of the refugees. But if I may, I'd like to add two points as well, extremely very quickly. I'd like to go back to His Highness' point about the Levant. In the early days of the crisis, I distinctly remember how Turkey was very much engaged in a dialogue with Jordan and Lebanon concerning assisting these refugees. Unfortunately, subsequently, the Turkish foreign policy went into a completely different direction, and that dialogue collapsed. I very much would like to see this dialogue being reconstructed, and one area in which concretely this could be done is, I know it's very short notice, but it's in relation to the WTO ministerial conference that's coming up in November. Couldn't, even if at the last minute, these three countries and maybe with like-minded countries come together and push this trade facilitation idea that also Yusuf, I think, very briefly mentioned.
Okay, I wonder if before I turn it over to Lloyd to make closing comments, if anyone would like to respond to the question about whether Muslim and Arab states have a moral obligation to receive refugees from other Muslim countries, thinking particularly about Afghanistan.
If I may just suggest that when you say Muslim and Arab states, you're saying basically a collective of states. So the Levant represents what you're talking about. ASEAN, for example, have monarchies, socialist states, different approaches. We have different approaches. I think the time has come, if I may suggest to you, that the arts of living, which are described as artfully alluding to a sense of skill, grace, and creativity. And I quote a brilliant article, which I will bring to your attention on this particular subject, articulating artfulness, exploring the ecological potential of creative conversation. Can we explore the ecological, sociological potential of the Levant before we commit ecocide and sociocide? I mean, we're thinking together. It's cogence that we need. God forbid that it's no longer politically correct that we even think independently. I mean, everybody talks about human rights, but I think that the Arab states have the OIC, they have the Arab League. None of these umbrella organizations, even ECOSOC is headed by a Kuwaiti lady who is a wonderful lady in Lebanon, but I've tried to speak about this shared ethos in the context of the Levant, and this is something that I really would recommend to you, Lloyd, if I may, to talk about another region which is bereft, but I don't think that bilateral approaches are adequate at all.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of our panelists. We'll turn now to our esteemed chair of the World Refugee Migration Council, Lloyd Axworthy, to offer some closing comments. Lloyd.
Thanks, Beth, and thanks to all of you for not only participating this morning, but in the research and the efforts that's gone into helping to redefine, I think, the narrative and redefine what are the premises by which we have to begin approaching refugee migration issues. It, to me, demonstrates just how important serious research is and is required. To go back to Naha's point of the xenophobia, a large amount of xenophobia is created by mythology, fantasy, conspiracy. It's not rooted in facts and data. And I think the exercise this morning and Beth, under your leadership coordination, I think demonstrates the important value of being able to take a very clear-cut case of Syrian refugees and the impact on their host neighbors, and relate it back to some really quite important and consequential decisions. In saying that, I think, as strange as it may sound in this gloomy time, I think the tectonic plates are shifting. The withdrawal of the Americans from Afghanistan comes at just about the same period as the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which spawned the whole exercise, to say nothing of what happened in Iraq and tangentially Syria. What it demonstrates is that the two things. One, the new Biden doctrine is to say the United States will no longer, provide this kind of global form of intervention unilaterally through military means. It opens up then the question of what's the alternative? Do we simply retreat further inside our boundaries and become even more xenophobic, or do we try to find a model for a different kind of international sense of peace, order, and stability? And one of the key words that came up in the discussion from His Highness and others is the importance of human security, protection of people. That's been a kind of interest of mine from the days back when I was in foreign affairs. And I think it is even more important today that we begin to look at how we use these tools that have been part of the recommendations in the reports: trade, the debt relief, drawing rights at IMF. These are not sort of insurmountable issues. I mean, it simply takes some serious negotiation, diplomacy, agreement, building consensus. And if in fact the so-called advantage of the militarization of our international order, so that when you deal with refugees, it's about border controls and more policemen, can be reallocated, it's going to have to come from different countries. And I think there's an opening, there's a hole there. What's the old Leonard Cohen song? There's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. Well, I think there's some cracks appearing about how some of these issues, and I think I couldn't agree more with His Royal Highness about doing it on a regional basis. The Levant, Central America, sort of Southeast Asia, what's happening now in Central Asia with Afghanistan, what's happening in some of the areas of Africa, Ethiopia, Tigray, Eritrea, you name it. But there are these incredibly important sort of mobility issues taking place, and they need to be answered through a kind of regional cooperation and coordination. Our own council is now working with others to develop the same kind of regional approach for the movements coming out of Central America and the Latin American states in the region of the Western Hemisphere. A third factor, which again has been mentioned, is employment. And one of the basic sort of propositions of those who are becoming green is that this leads to more employment, not less. And when I think of the vast amount of work that needs to be done in all parts of the world to provide for fresh water, to offset the impacts of droughts, being able to provide food security and food supply in crucial areas. This is going to take an awful lot of skill, a lot of sort of human capital to invest, and that means employment. but you have to pay for it. And I think that the sooner we get away from the sort of massive expenditures we make on arms and into an area where that can be allocated to put people to work in helping to change and mediate the impact of climate, and to make sure that part of that protection of people is in a basic food and livelihood goal, I think we can begin to make some changes. And finally, I guess come back to a point where I hope that this is the beginning of a discussion amongst the researchers and the group is here, because I think you hit a number of very important pressure points. You've supplied very important data, very interesting recommendations. The next step is how do you kind of translate that into action, translate that into political agreement. And that means that there has to be not just a willingness of governments, but also to integrate the work of the civil societies, faith-based groups, the issue of Muslim or sort of obligation, I think is a good one, because let's face it, in so many parts of the world, much of the decisions is going to come out of faith-based institutions and organizations and agencies. And whether it's Christendom or Muslim or Buddhism, I think that there has to be more attention paid to helping to mobilize, energize those very important players to help reshape the kind of direction we have. So I found it a very stimulating, well, for me, it's in the morning, early in the morning, but stimulating nonetheless. I hope that the work can continue and build upon. I think we'll, at the council, certainly take a look, and I want to end this benediction by again thanking Beth, His Royal Highness, researchers who have spoken today. It's been a very important, one of the most interesting, important early mornings I've spent in a very long time. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Lloyd, and thanks to all of our panelists, to Princess Anne, and to all of those who tuned in to listen. We do hope to work on some of the follow-up to this and to see the way in which more support can be given to countries that are hosting large numbers of refugees for more than a decade now. But thanks to all of you, and we will post the video on the website as well as all the reports. I hope that you've been interested in just hearing snippets of the research to really dive into some of the papers, and there are short versions of them as well as longer versions. But thanks again, and everybody stay safe and have a nice week. Bye-bye.
Great.